Welcome to Leaf Status Report for January 6th, 2026. I'm a bit later releasing this today because I did spend a bit of time trying to cut my runtime for my total simulation down to make way for the extra time that I think adding in the playoff sims is going to contribute. Funny enough, I got rid of 81% of the total runtime, so we're in very good shape for when I'm able to add that. That being said, today I've also simulated over twice as many times. We've simulated the rest of the NHL regular season 11,000 times on the dot. The Leafs' total points today form this distribution. All things considered, the two games we were looking at yesterday went fairly well. The Mammoth Rangers game ended with a Rangers overtime loss, 3-2. And as we did expect, that basically doesn't move the Rangers' gap to the Leafs. Our other game, which was the Red Wings Senators, was lose-lose or win-win, depending on whether or not you want to be an optimist or pessimist about the Leafs' future in making the playoffs this season. However, I did mention that we were slightly hoping for a Sens loss over a Red Wings loss, which is what we got. The Red Wings beat the Sens 5-3. Obviously, that is going to pull the Red Wings further away from the Leafs in today's projections. It does bring them up to A3 today. However, it does also drag the Senators down. The Sens fall all the way down to wildcard 4, and the Leafs are now within striking distance of them. The Leafs gained 0.02 expected points today, going from 91.09 yesterday to 91.11 today. Our only caveat with this is that based on the theoretical value of expected points I've calculated for today, our simulation still collectively overestimated the Leafs by about 0.05 expected points on average. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on whether or not you like certainty more than this segment being interesting, our expected points breakdown is very boring today. Substituting all of yesterday's game data into today's simulation yielded a gain of only 0.01 expected points, and we had the same number of overtime games today as we did yesterday per simulation, which of course gives us no change whatsoever. Therefore, randomness favored the Leafs by a single hundredth of an expected point more today than it did yesterday. The minimum number of points the Leafs scored in a simulation today was 68, and the maximum number of points they scored in a season today was 112. That gives us an absolute range today of 44 points. Our inner 70% interval again remains constant over yesterday. Our 15th percentile season still sits at 85 points, and our 85th percentile season still sits at 97 points. Our standard deviation goes down ever so slightly over yesterday. Yesterday it was 5.88 points, and today it's down to 5.84 points. The Leafs gained 0.1% on their playoff odds today. Yesterday, they made the playoffs in 31.9% of all simulations, and today they've made the playoffs in 32.0% of all simulations. Because we have so many more simulations than we did yesterday, our 95% confidence interval goes down by a considerable amount over yesterday. Today, our 95% confidence interval for our playoff odds of 32% is plus or minus 0.87%. Looking at our general EP spread across the entire league, today, the Leafs sit in 19th place overall in terms of expected points, with 18 teams still within one standard deviation of them. Beyond this, there is a little bit of extra good news, which is that only out of those 18 teams within one standard deviation in expected points, only 6 of them sit below the Leafs, with the other 12 sitting above. Generally, this implies that the Leafs have a better chance of chasing more teams down in the expected points race than they do of being chased down. Consulting the table, really, unsurprisingly, the big story on the table today is the Ottawa Senators and Detroit Red Wings shift from their game last night. As I did mention earlier, the Detroit Red Wings, as we can see, are back into that A3 spot, whereas the Ottawa Senators have dropped all the way down to wildcard 4, and with that margin of 1.46 expected points, with a sufficiently good Leafs performance, although it would have to be very good today against the Panthers, the Leafs could in theory chase them down by tomorrow. Running over the basic margins, the Leafs now sit 16.9 expected points behind the Tampa Bay Lightning in the division lead. That actually hasn't changed over yesterday. They now sit 7.33 expected points behind second in the Atlantic, held by Montreal. 3.93 expected points behind third in the Atlantic, held by Detroit, and they now sit 2.68 expected points outside of the playoffs. Now that margin outside of the playoffs has gone down ever so slightly. Mind you, it hasn't gone down by much. The Detroit Red Wings, if you'll remember, were our second wildcard team yesterday, with that margin of 2.85 expected points. So this margin is less than 0.2 of an expected point gap shrink. Overall, though, we'll take any improvement we can get, and definitely with exactly the right game results, a gap of 2.68 expected points is something the Leafs can make up if they can win the next couple games. Starting with what's obviously the most important game today, at least for us Leafs fans, at 7:30 p.m., the Leafs are going to be hosting the Florida Panthers. Now, that gap up to the Florida Panthers that the Leafs have right now to make up is 3.21 expected points, which very technically can be made up in a single game. I believe back in early November, we did see an expected points gap shift of 4 expected points in one day. However, that did require one of our teams to win by a large margin and the other team to lose by a huge margin. However, since the Toronto Maple Leafs and Florida Panthers are in the same game, that is a lot more probable of an outcome than it would have been if they were playing separate games and we had to rely on 2 different game results. Now, I think feasibly, in order for the Leafs to be able to pass the Florida Panthers in expected points in a single day, they'd probably need to win by at least 3 goals, absolute minimum. Now, do I think that's going to happen? No, of course I don't. The Florida Panthers have Brad Marchand, and if there's one thing I know about the Leafs, it's that Brad Marchand is the bane of their existence. Looking at our other 4 key games, at 7 p.m., our first 2 key teams play. The Buffalo Sabres host the Vancouver Canucks, and the Philadelphia Flyers host the Anaheim Ducks. Now, both of them have expected points yields north of 1.2 points. However, the Buffalo Sabres are a lot closer to the Leafs in expected points gap. I think since we're kind of relying on the Leafs to beat the Panthers tonight, we're actually perfectly fine with a Buffalo Sabres overtime loss. I think it just barely creeps the Leafs over the Buffalo Sabres in tomorrow's standings, if everything goes about as expected. However, the Flyers, I think, do need to lose in regulation. I don't think an underperformance of 0.21 expected points on game result will be enough to slip them below the Leafs in tomorrow's projections. So maybe we want a regulation loss by about 2 goals for the Flyers. We'll just go with that. At 7:30 p.m., the New York Islanders host the New Jersey Devils. I think we're not going to try and think about the Leafs trying to chase down the Islanders at this point. We're mostly focused on just keeping the New Jersey Devils behind them. However, I do think nonetheless we want this to be a close game. Ideally, I think we see a New Jersey Devils regulation loss, but I think technically an overtime loss is fine because they do have an expected points yield for this game of 1.11 points. Finally, at 10 p.m., the San Jose Sharks host the Columbus Blue Jackets. Again, the Blue Jackets are behind the Leafs at the moment. However, they have a gap of 1.53 expected points, and their expected points yield is well above 1, so we are fine with an overtime loss, but of course, regulation loss is always preferable. Looking at the Leafs' placing distribution, before I forget again, we can see that the Leafs' most probable finish is still a 3, although obviously their playoff odds are much lower than 50% because they've got a fairly equally probable spread basically from A3 all the way down to wildcard 10, just because of how close that Atlantic Division and Metropolitan Division are right now. Conditional on the Leafs actually making the playoffs, the probabilities across my simulations of the Leafs starting seedings in the playoffs fell down to about this. Quickly looking at the Canadian teams, there's really only 2 big changes here. The Ottawa Senators take an absolute nosedive because they lost to the Detroit Red Wings, which pushes them out of a projected divisional spot. And the Calgary Flames seem to be falling back down to earth, and by earth I mean the bottom of the Pacific Division. President's Trophy, Avs highly favored, but Montreal and Seattle make a cameo.